बेहद इम्पोर्टेंट स्पीकर हमारे बीच हैं। मैं अचिन विनायक को बुलाना चाहूँगा, वो अपनी बात आकर रखें। अचिन विनायक।
First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I don't live very far away, and while I was coming to JNU, I saw something very strange. I saw a politician who had his hands in his own pockets. Anyway, tomorrow, December 6th, we all know what happened in 1992. And there is a continuity between 1992 and today. Obviously, the forces of Hindutva have grown, and what has happened now with the election of Modi is intimately, of course, connected to all that event and all that happened afterwards, because it was one of the biggest mass movements by the right since independence. It was confronted not by a counter movement or mass movement, but at best by state authority. It gave it a breathing space, but it was not confronted by that. That has been a force which has its roots up and down in the spores of civil society over a very prolonged period of time, something that in fact the left in India had a history of, but in many ways has weakened in comparison to what's happened on the right. The appeal of Modi and Hindutva that has grown is not simply related to the question of Hindutva itself. It's also related to the particular kind of nationalism that is being projected, which is a much more aggressive and belligerent and pernicious nationalism. And if it is being more attractive, we must make India strong, because that's the biggest, if you like, component of that nationalism. This is the way to make India strong. It's obviously, its appeal is also stronger because we're operating in a terrain in which there is a much more frustrated and insecure sense of self and nationalism. That's what they are going to suggest. I also want to connect this kind of nationalism to internationalism, and I want to connect it, like some of the other speakers have done, to the question of capitalism. Let's start with capitalism. And a very famous statement that Marx made about capitalism. He said, all that is solid melts into air. What did he mean? All that is solid melts into air. It's all fixed, fast, frozen relations. Capitalist modernity or capitalist industrialization, capitalist development has created a change whose rate, whose depth, whose scope is far deeper and greater than ever as compared to all prehistory or pre-modernity or pre-capitalist history. The rate, the scope, the depth of change. In other words, the question of constant change, the question of flux, the question of uncertainty is something that becomes very, very important at multiple levels. Marx also talked about alienation. Alienation of humans, of workers from their product, from their fellow workers and beings, from nature, and even from themselves. What he meant by workers alienated from themselves, of course, was they're alienated from their potential in terms of what you can do. So how do you fight this alienation, which is also connected to the rhythms of capitalist development? Because when you change, revolutionize the means of production, you annihilate space by time, and so on, the universalizing tendency of capitalism, things change so much and so dramatically. What does it mean in a person's life? I just want to bring this here. And as capitalism expands, it creates its own, as a process of change, this dimension of uncertainty of change, which is accelerated, also creates its own problems. Take, for example, the life of an ordinary person in pre-capitalist societies. 25 kilometers radius, 10 kilometers radius. It's a static life. Now, say for example, since the mid or late 70s, 1970s onwards, because please notice one thing, the rise of negative politics of cultural exclusivism is not specific to India, but took place throughout the world from the late 70s onwards. It took the form of the politics of ethnicity, of irredentist nationalisms, of religion. Not just Hindutva, You've seen that here. Why? Why from the late 70s? Why not in the third quarter of the 20th century? In fact, the third quarter of the 20th century was one in which you had very powerful movements of various kinds, in what was called the backward countries. You had the struggles for national liberation, many of which moved in the socialist direction. You had powerful progressive movements of various kinds, predominantly secular, about livelihood issues. If you look at the pattern of popular movements and struggles in India, you find that there is a shift from struggle over livelihood issues, price, etc., so on, to more cultural issues later on. So the Indian phenomenon is part of a larger historical phenomenon. And in this process of transnational capitalist globalization, neoliberal globalization, a much more mean and miserly form of globalization, what actually happens? What happens, in fact, is that the lived experience of a person is no longer comprehensible at all. Your life is more out of control, it's more uncertain. Even trying to understand the meaning of that life becomes far more difficult because everything that actually shapes your life is not something that you have control over. This is throughout capitalism, it gets accelerated more and more. This gives rise to all kinds of problems. The search for meaning, the search of understanding. And in such a situation, there is always a temptation to try to fall back and develop some kind of stable psychic, cultural moorings of various kinds. A tendency, not a certain, but a tendency to want to grab onto those particular identities, if you like, that seem more stable. Those identities that you're supposedly born with. Religion, caste, this, that, etc. What I'm suggesting is, of course, is that with the rise of capitalism and all, you have all kinds of struggles. The struggles against injustices, the struggles to end that alienation, which of course become an anti-systemic struggle, the struggle for socialism as elsewhere. But you also have other ways and attempts to try and cope with the uncertainties and difficulties and complexities of capitalist development. You have a rise of all kinds of identity politics. But identity politics can be of two types. They can be progressive identity politics, and they can be very negative identity politics. Progressive identity politics will take place when oppressed identities and groups struggle for it, on race, gender, caste, and so on. But those are not the only kind of identity politics. You have all kinds of other identity politics, which are not necessarily progressive at all, which are in fact very, very negative in many cases. Late 70s, worldwide, increasing politics of cultural exclusivism, even as the capitalist economy is getting more and more integrated. In other words, you're having a rightward shift, but you cannot have a rightward shift which is only economic. You can only have a rightward shift if there's also a rightward shift politically and ideologically to stabilize the overall framework of an overall rightward shift. But insofar as a capitalist globalizing economy is taking place within a framework of multiple national states, the particular forms that will be taken by right-wing politics and by right-wing ideology will be much more regionally and nationally specific. They will be different in Israel, they'll be different in India, they'll be different in the United States, they'll be different there and here. They will be related much more to the specific histories of those parts of the world. If you take three liberal democracies, for example, India, whatever the weaknesses, India, United States, Britain, what do you find? You find from the late 70s onwards, still variable in India comes from the mid-80s, you find the rise of a far right, a real right wing. Please remember that a stable neoliberal right-wing politics or economics, because it's both economics and politics, can only be stable if in a liberal democracy the main opposition party also comes to accept that. What did you have in the United States? You have the rise of Reaganism, you have a reaction in the Democratic Party, Jesse Jackson and others, which seeks to, if you like, maintain the historical legacy of the Democratic Party, which is defeated. And after which you have a new Labour, a new Democrats of Clinton and so on, which is much more to the right. That's when you have a stabilization of right-wing politics, economics, and ideology in the United States. What did you have in Britain? You have the rise of Thatcherism. right? You have Tony Benn and the rise of Bennism, which seeks to, if you like, maintain and even deepen the historical legacy of the Labour Party, and it is defeated. And after it is defeated, you have the rise of a new Labour, of Blair. You stabilize that. What did you have in India? Unlike in Britain and the United States, where at least the Democratic Party and the Labour Party have had strong organizational roots in this thing here, the Congress Party, by the mid-80s, had lost it completely. It was no longer the Congress Party of either independence or the 2 or 3 decades after independence. It's a party which is basically left the machine dominating the top. And therefore, all it required to change it there, if you like, was a shift there. And the rise of Hindutva actually helped pull the Congress Party to the right. And the difference between the two of them on the question of communalism is that the Congress Party practices pragmatic communalism and the BJP practices programmatic communalism. The Congress Party is a fundamental factor, and its trajectory is a fundamental factor which has also helped the BJP, the RSS, and the others to actually improve, even as there is a difference between the two. And the difference between the two is bigger than the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, and between Labour and the Conservatives, for example, other parties there. And that difference is because BJP, the Sun, has a rooted cadre base, this thing, deep in civil society, with a particular perspective with regard to the question of nationalism and communalism. What is the BJP's message? Because this neoliberalism is also meant, as others pointed out, a much greater acceleration of inequalities and despair of various kinds. A much more ruthless exploitation in various levels that is taking place there, which adds, of course, its own dimension of frustration and so on. But what is the message that the BJP and the Sun gives forward? We must make India strong. How do you make India strong? Hindus must unite. Savarkar's famous programmatic statement: unite Hindus and militarize Hinduism. Question then becomes, how do you unite Hindus? There are only 2 ways that you can go about trying to unite Hindus. There are not 3 ways, no 4 ways, just 2 ways. Right? And you have to give emphasis, even as you try both ways, on one way. One way, you find an principle of unification internal to Hinduism. What can that be? The biggest candidate and the best candidate for it is a loose and accommodating Brahmanism. And therefore, you push that. And you get some success. It's growing because lower caste in many ways feel that at least culturally, there is a cultural mobility upwards by identification with the larger Hindu, but you can only go Hindu community, but you can only go so far. The other principle is much more important. And that is the principle which is external to Hinduism, which is that unite Hindus against something. The Christians, the communists, but the Christians are too small. The number here, and the history of war is different. It's the Muslims and Islam. And this, of course, has also been reinforced on the international level by this war on terror, which has led to the demonization of Islam and Muslims and the rise of a new kind of racism in Europe, which is much more Muslim preoccupied, right, than it is, and Islam preoccupied than it is the question of color. But this is the ways in which you have, if you like, the reinforcement of various kinds of things at both the international and the national level. And therefore, the BJP has been pushing this. And it has been doing so with some particular success. If you recognize that we live in a state system of multiple national states, as well as one in which you have the transnationalization of capitalism in various ways, there is a very important relationship between the state system and that overall global economic system, in the sense that you cannot get away from the fact that it is states and the state system that must provide the necessary factors of stabilization for capitalism to work. Intrinsic to capitalism and the source of its dynamism is the principle of competition. But that competition cannot operate successfully without there being a stable framework which allows the rhythms of accumulation to take place. And that stable framework, not just economically in terms of financial macro management, in terms of national currencies, in terms of this, that, but also at the political level and at the ideological level, doesn't come from some overall global framework, but comes, if you like, from state system and from multilateral institutions, IMF, World Bank, which are multilateral, which are not transnational. In other words, you have a dialectic of the international and the national state, which you can't get away from. Ironically, that means that in different parts of the world, you don't have an overcoming of nationalism with regard to internationalism. You have a relationship which is a much more complex relationship there. And there are two ways that you can think about nationalism. Two ways. One is to see nationalism as an inheritance. What does that mean? That nationalism has an essence, a core. If you see it as an essence, if you see it as something that is there, then you're saying that this is the essence of nationalism. This is something that we've inherited in India. But Hinduism is the essence of Indian nationalism. It is what belongs to the past. It's what we've inherited. And if you see nationalism as an inheritance, there are always going to be disputes about what is the proper inheritance and who are the proper inheritors. And that's what we have. And unfortunately, that's dominant. In order to fight for a progressive internationalism, which we must fight, we cannot avoid the need to also fight for a progressive nationalism. And nationalism is so complicated that not only is there negative nationalism and progressive nationalism, but within progressive nationalism there's also negativities. Nonetheless, you can't get away from it. The second way of looking at nationalism is not to see it as an inheritance, but to see it as an ongoing political project, what we make of it. What does that mean? It means that we have to shape what Indian nationalism is, and that has to be a democratic nationalism. How is it going to be democratic? It's going to be democratic and inclusive if, in fact, the people in the Northeast also feel part of that. But why should the people in the Northeast or in Kashmir feel part of Indian nationalism if the Indian state and the Indian nation does not address their concerns and their interests, which are not just cultural in terms of respect for their culture and their language and this and that, but is also, of course, not just political, but economic and social. And if that's not the case, right, obviously you're going to have it. In other words, there is another conception of a nationalism which is democratic, which is an ongoing political project in terms of what we make of it. And this is related also to the question of what we understand by culture. And just as in the case of nationalism, you have two understandings of nationalism. There are two ways in which you can try and understand culture. Again, you can see culture in essentialist terms. And this tends to be a preoccupation of post-colonialists and many others who are going on and on about difference with a big D. But leave that aside. Either you can see that as, in fact, an essence, in which case you're going to have the same problems, or you can see it as a process. What I want to suggest to you is that when the BJP says that India must be strong, and in order for us to be strong, we must be culturally strong, they're correct. But what do they mean by being culturally strong? That's the crucial question. And culture is always five things. It's plural. We have multiple identities and we have the cultures that are related to those multiple identities. I'm a Malayali, I'm a Punjabi, I'm this, I'm that, I'm studying in a convent school, I've got a JNUSU culture, this, that, thousands, all kinds of things here. And modern life is about, in fact, knowing where to shift which identity is particularly important at which particular point of time. It's not seeing things in a fixed identity. Sometimes you have in the media this ridiculous kind of headlines. Plane crash, 300 people killed, 52 Indians killed. You're supposed to be much more concerned about the fact that Indians have been killed rather than that. It's always plural. It's ordinary. Let's talk about the great Indian culture of art, because culture is about the propositions and meanings that people make, which also shape their lives externally from them. And how on earth can you talk about cultural empowerment if you have a culturally essentialist understanding? You talk about the great cultures of the past, but one of the great modern things that have taken place, and one of the great potential assets, it can go from bad to worse, is mass literacy. And what mass literacy does, of course, it gives us a cultural empowerment which can be used for better or worse, but it's a form of cultural empowerment. It's one that can empower you. And the fact that we have mass literacy on balance is a good thing. So, the question of ordinariness, Salman Rushdie's work can shape things in a way you can't because of mass communication, this, that, and so on. So it's plural, it's ordinary, it's open. It's open to all kinds of influences. I think an earlier speaker spoke about, I think Professor Mukhya spoke about cricket. Remember K.R. Mulkani's cricket test? About how Indians, Muslims must support the Indian team when Pakistan is playing with us. Why don't they do that? I was in England and I always supported, although I was an ordinary citizen and had all the rights in England, I always supported every non-white team that came because of the existence of racism in Britain. So what? If I support that doesn't mean I should not have new rights. But the interesting thing is that Mulkani used the cricket. He didn't say cricket is a foreign import, which is coming to India, and really we should abandon cricket and we should make Kho-Kho the national game of India. It doesn't say that. It's open. The films that I used to see in Hindi films that are Ye Mara, Wo Mara Khatm. Now, of course, it's all dishing, legs, this thing here, karate, all this. The music has changed a lot. What does it mean? It means it's open. You have, with the emergence of mass communications, not just elite culture or high culture, not just popular culture, but you also have mass culture. And mass culture, of course, music, dance, spectator sports, have become very, very, very important. It's an indication, if you like, of the openness, the changing character of culture. And of course, lastly, it's expanding. It's expanding because we also recognize the question of the expansion of rights. And as society changes, right, cultural dimension changes. Today there is a new culture connected to mass communication which I am simply not familiar with, which has to do with social media and the virtual culture of social media. But it's part of that. You have to get away from the kind of thinking that they represent. Yeah. How are we going to fight it? What is the Modi government going to do? Let's be very clear. It's going to push the Hindutva agenda. And three things in particular. It's going to push the question of building a mandir at Ayodhya. It's going to push, in my view, the question of Article 370 at some time, but when? The strategy seems to be that as far as from the top is concerned, we will push at the education front from the government level, but we will leave it to our foot soldiers and the other groups and organizations in civil society to go ahead and to create the climate in a variety of different ways, which is exactly what is happening. 2002 was the first communal riot involving Muslims which expanded into the rural areas. You had the same thing in Muzaffarnagar. After the election of Modi, you've had 600 plus small communal incidents in UP. You've had 180 odd in Bihar. You had all over these places, which are small scales of forms of polarization, etc. Because you have to play a game. You can't get it too big. You also alienate the corporate sector, this, that, etc. with this thing here. At the same time, you have to polarize. And you're doing this, and people are saying this, that, etc. You have a cabinet, which is one of the most disgraceful cabinets we've ever had in terms of criminals. In terms of the number of criminals here. No problem. So on one hand, you have that. My own perspective, which could be quite wrong, is that Modi's government is going to concentrate on the question of the economy and the corporatization and accelerating, as my previous speaker pointed out, accelerating at the level of foreign policy and economic policy, what was there before, but much more ruthlessly. They're going to do that, in the belief that this kind of neoliberal agenda is going to, in fact, give more support from those which he thinks will benefit the corporate sector and the middle class. And there's no reason why he may not even believe that neoliberalism, like so many others, will also benefit a larger section of society, the mass section, and therefore he'll become even more popular. The first statement in the speech he made after coming to power was, "Give me 10 years." So I see him thinking, in the first stage, concentrate on that. Education certainly push at the government level, create the debate about Article 370, Uniform Civil Code, this, that, etc. here. Later on, either in his first term or in his second term, to begin to push these more aggressively from the top. Of course, it could be accelerated this thing here. Is he going to succeed in getting more and more support? Well, that depends. One thing is certain, his economic policies are going to fail. there is going to be very, very serious economic, social discontent related to the fact that there is no way that this is going to create enough decent jobs of various kinds. Plus, of course, all the other aspects that is going to come by accumulation and dispossession through the kind of neoliberalism, extractivism that we've talked about over here. This obviously creates a framework in which you can fight against the Modi government, but the opposition is so weak. Therefore, it's not certain that it will go in this direction, it can go in the other direction here. One thing is that as it pushes the Hindutva agenda, right, you cannot push the Hindutva agenda aimed at inferiorizing Muslims and the status of Muslims without moving, of course, to a much more authoritarian system in some way or the other, but within a framework which will also be democratic procedurally in various ways and so on here. And that will necessarily mean that they are going to have to come down hard on those who are opposing him because of his inferiorization of Muslims and, of course, of the authoritarian implications of this and the authoritarian association and conjunction of this with the whole series of other authoritarian policies. And who's going to oppose this? Liberals? But many liberals will shift. Many liberal intellectuals have already started shifting. Right? And the left. And there may certainly be a small section of the left that could also shift and adjust in many ways. But the left remains, probably speaking, still the most important source of opposition towards it. But the opposition is so big. How do we fight it? We recognize that that is going to be an occasion and opportunity. But two things. One, obviously, the left must try and come together. And not just the left, various social movements which must come together, but in fact are segmented and sectorally based. We should try to do in the long run the kind of strategy that the left once had, and which doesn't require simply the left, and that is burrowing into the pores of civil society. Because whether it's political Islamist groups, or whether it's the RSS, or whether it's other groups, much of their strength comes in civil society from addressing the non-religious, cultural and material needs of people. If you're in a particular area where there's an RSS person who's in the shack over there, and you need a doctor, and that RSS person comes and gets a doctor to help treat your daughter or your son, you're going to feel obligated, and you're going to feel loyal and admiring that person here. And it's because they can do all these things here that they also get. The same thing applies, of course, to political Islam and all those other forces. And what is the message? It connects with what others have said. You cannot have a specific perspective to only fight it on the level of nationalism or on the level of secularism versus communalism. It has to be connected to a much wider struggle at various fronts. And I would insist, like a previous speaker did, and ironically enough, you have to connect it to the question of socialism. Because the kind of capitalism is a disaster. This is not just a kind, there's no option really. The idea that you can have a humanistic sort of capitalism which can address the ecological problem is not all. And if you are going to have a perspective of trying to move towards socialism, then we come back, whether we like it or not, to the question of class. I'm constantly amazed that there are people who are talking about why do you privilege class in the struggle for socialism? This is an arrogance on your part. This is just one identity among others. And what are the other reasons they say that? Well, is the working class for socialism? Most of the working class is not. Are there not people who are not workers who are for socialism? Yes, there are. Right? So why privileging the working class in the struggle for socialism? Let me turn it around. In the women's movement, most women are not necessarily supportive of feminism. There are even men who are supportive of feminism. Would you deny or doubt that women necessarily are the, objectively speaking, privileged category in the struggle against sexism? It would be crazy to say no. Obviously, women will remain the privileged category in the struggle against sexism, just as lower castes will remain, even if they are not conscious of it, or this, that, etc., privileged category, the objectively privileged category there. And this doesn't seem to arouse any, it seems very obvious. Because they are the ones most oppressed. The same thing applies with regard to the question of fighting capitalism. Because what is fundamental to capitalism is the identity of class.
Why is that the case?